So we're all forced into this very strange situation, having to work from home and somehow find a way to make that function. And of course, none of us really know when that's going to change or if it's going to change and what's going to happen on the other side. So today's session is going to be on just some simple tips and tricks for working from home work, right? So that we can actually sort of take really good care of our well-being, but also to make sure that we're staying focused on what's important. So you'll leave the session with some really practical tips. Working from home can be a really good thing, as some of you are starting to discover. And some research from Harvard in 2015 actually found that it can lead to really positive outcomes for individuals and for the company. So Nicholas Bloom, in this particular study, looked at employees at a call center in what was, at the time anyway, China's largest online travel agency, CNET. And they ran an experiment where for 9 months, the employees were allowed to opt to go and work from home. And a large number of them put up their hand to do that. And they were then randomized, and half of them were forced to stay behind in the office, but the other half were allowed to go and work from home. And at the end of that 9 months, when they crunched the stats, they found that the organization as a whole had a 13% increase in productivity. And 9% of that was attributed to people taking fewer breaks. They were just working more of the day, shorter lunch breaks, not kind of shirking off. And 4% of that 13% was because the environment was quieter and somehow more conducive to getting work done. Interestingly, after 9 months, they tweaked the experiment and they gave people an opportunity to come back into the office. And about half of them decided to do that. Half the people decided to keep working from home, but the other 50% decided that for whatever reason, they really wanted to be back in the office, whether they couldn't discipline themselves and couldn't stay focused, or perhaps they were just missing the social interaction with their colleagues. Maybe they needed that positive peer pressure or that direct supervision to get their work done. After 9 months of that, the overall productivity increased to 22%. And so what that experiment tells us is that when the right people are working from home, it's fantastic. You can have really good outcomes. But of course, given that we're all forced into this situation right now, I guess it makes sense to look at what was it about the people working from home that was actually working well, and how could we implement some of those strategies into our own work practices so that we're productive and happy. The first thing that we want to do is to have a solid routine. I mean, it's so important. You know, I know a lot of you, I was speaking to Claire before, and I know a lot of you are having sort of stand-up meetings every day to start the day, and perhaps a lot of you are actually having meeting after meeting on Zoom. But what's really important to do is to try to maintain as much of that usual work structure as possible. So getting up in the morning and getting dressed, I mean, that puts us into the right frame of mind, the right mindset. Starting the day and ending the day at set times rather than just sort of, getting to work whenever we get there or allowing that work to bleed over into our home life. Also really important, as is taking breaks. A lot of us now, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, we're spending all day in front of screens. We have our meetings on screens. We have our emails, we have all of our tasks. And so often we don't even change posture or get away from that screen for extended periods of time. And it's really important to do that. So after finishing a meeting, before checking the emails, might be a really good idea just to stop, stand up, stretch, take a break, go and make a cup of tea. Just do something that would simulate or let's say emulate what would normally happen at work, which is you finish a meeting and you walk back to your desk and then maybe you do something else and walk to the next meeting. So again, very important just to have a sort of an environment at home that sort of approximates our working day. And again, of course, the physical environment is super important. It's very important that we have, if we can, a particular place in our house where we go and work, and ideally where we only do work. So when we sit down, there's nothing else there to distract us. When we've finished, we can close the laptop, we can put things away. And then when we go back to the rest of our lives, we're able to make that set shift consciously and appropriately. So having a good routine and a good environment, that's the first thing. And that's one of the things that those CNET employees who worked well at home, that's what they were doing well. Of course, if you've got kids at home, like so many of us do, trying to work while educating them, it's going to be hard to stay focused for long periods of time. I mean, there might be ways of managing that. But if the kids are sort of interrupting the flow, when we have time to work, we want to make every second count of that time. And so that's the second tip that I want to present to you today, which is to make sure that we're not getting distracted by things that we don't need to be distracted by. The kids are one thing, but the phone being with us, the TV being on, the thing about the fridge, multiple tabs open on our computer, all of these things can really get in the way, as I'm sure you've noticed, of really productive work and good quality work. And so minimizing the negative impact of digital technology is the second thing that I wanted to talk about today. I spent a lot of time, those of you who've heard me talk before, I spent a lot of time now talking about how technology, when it's used badly, can be a seriously negative influence in our lives. And of course, when it's used well, it can add a lot. It's designed to hijack our attention, particularly smartphones and digital technology like that. It's designed to hijack our attention. If you think about the business model of YouTube and Facebook, it's to keep us watching, keep us scrolling so that they can show us more ads. So they've got a vested interest in hijacking and capturing our attention. Add into that the fact that every time we get an email or unlock our phone or jump on Facebook, we release a chemical called dopamine in the brain, get a little dopamine hit. Now, dopamine and the nucleus accumbens, where it's released, is designed to reinforce novelty-seeking behavior, to help us to explore new ways of doing things. And what happens if I bang these two bits of flint together or climb that mountain over there? That's what dopamine's designed to do. But every time you get a notification, guess what? Dopamine hit. And of course, the phone being designed to hijack our attention means we get into this kind of perfect storm in a way, of this negative cycle. And it can lead to addiction. And of course, when we're overusing or misusing technology, we see a lot of deficits to well-being. I mean, we know that, using phones in bed and the blue light keeping us awake, or too much social media leading to things like depression and anxiety and comparing ourselves with others, things like that. But even just having a phone with us, according to research from 2017, even just having a phone with us will decrease our performance on whatever task we're doing. Some experimenters ran an experiment where they got people to come in and do IQ testing, and everybody had their phone, everybody turned off their phone in the experiment. So the people who, they'll then split into three groups. One group put their phone outside the room in a locker. The next group had it sitting in their pocket, and the third group had it sitting on the desk with them while they were doing the testing. And what they found, as I'm sure you might expect, is the people that had their phone out of sight, out of mind, they had the best performance on every aspect. Having the phone switched off in your pocket led to significantly worse performance. So even just having it there somehow, and of course having it sitting on the desk, even though it was switched off, led to the worst performance overall, somehow just distracting us, stopping us from staying focused. And then of course, those phones were off. If we turn them back on and they're buzzing and ringing and lighting up, what impact is that having on our performance? Then there's checking emails. And another experiment that was done in 2015 found that every time we check an email, it takes about a minute, takes 64 seconds to get back to what we were doing, right? So it takes 64 seconds. I'm just going to share my screen for a sec. So this is, sorry, I forgot this slide here. These are the people who had the phone in the other room. You can see they had the best performance on things like short-term memory, fluid intelligence, pocket in the bag, slightly worse, and sitting on the desk, worst performance of all. So 2002, Jackson, Dawson and Wilson found that it takes about 64 seconds, just over a minute, to get our attention fully back on what we're doing after we check an email, which means if we check an email every 5 minutes in a typical week of work, we waste 8.5 hours, like an entire day. right? I mean, it's pretty, I guess, pretty simple maths, right? If every 5 minutes you lose a minute, that's 20% of our time that just gets burned. So again, managing that, really important. You know, not having the phone with us. So flight moding it, putting it out of reach, at least turning off the notifications, shutting off email notifications if we can, and checking email at set times during the day rather than every time that little window slides in. These things can make a big difference to our productivity and our well-being. Bombard ourselves with other people's ideas. It makes it very hard to have any fresh creative ideas of our own. And of course, that's what a lot of us are doing. We're waking up in the morning and we're grabbing our phone and we're perhaps checking the news or checking Facebook, and then we're getting up and having breakfast with the TV on. Then we're driving to work with the phone, playing music or a podcast or something. And there's this constant bombardment. And there's research that shows that when we have genuine downtime, when we get away from screens and stimulation, that's when new ideas can arise into our short-term memory capacity, which would otherwise just stay full of other people's ideas. So that's very important. And so, of course, there are just a few simple strategies that I've been mentioning as we've been going, you know, so flight moding the phone, putting it out of sight, putting it on Do Not Disturb, turning off notifications, and just using one device at a time. You know, all of these things can be really very important, but quite simple things to do. So once we've managed technology, we've got some chance of being able to manage our attention. And so this is where my expertise as a mindfulness facilitator, a mindfulness consultant come in. I'm a clinical psychologist, but I do a lot of mindfulness training, right? And of course, mindfulness is all about paying attention. So when we are trying to multitask, what we're actually doing is attention switching. If you look at how the brain processes complex information, and as a psychologist, I'm very interested in that, it turns out we can only focus on one thing at a time, right? We can do multiple simple things like chew gum and walk down the street and hum a tune without much problem, but two complex activities, suddenly we start to bump into problems. Because if we're focused on one thing, by definition, we can't be fully focused on the other thing, right? As well as that, every time we switch our attention from one thing to another, we lose half a second. There's a phenomenon called the attentional blink that takes place in the brain. So we switch our attention from one thing to something else, and for up to half a second, the brain goes offline or blinks, and we're unaware of anything that's happening in that moment. An experiment I like to use that brings that to life is this one. Just say to yourself silently in your head the letters A to Z as fast as you can. Okay, most of you probably already done that. Took what, 5 seconds, maybe 10 if you went slowly. Now the numbers 1 to 26 as fast as you can. Okay, so that's probably what, another 5, maybe 10 seconds, you know, a combined total of somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds. Now I want you to switch letters and numbers. So A1, B2, C3, D4, up to Z26 as fast as you can. So straight away, most people, when they do that, notice a really obvious slowing down. You might have noticed as you went from the letter to the number, it just takes a little bit of time. And that's just internal set shifting, let alone doing it in the environment. That's the attentional blink. That's happening all the time. And so here's a question for you. How many times in a typical day would you switch your attention from one thing to another? And if you multiply that number by half a second each time, how much time is that? It probably really starts to add up, doesn't it? Some of you might have lost track as well after perhaps D4. And how often does that happen? We start something, we get distracted by something else, maybe this thing or something else, and then we forget to finish what we were doing, right? So there are a lot of costs with trying to multitask. And the research is very clear. There are huge performance deficits. People driving a car and talking on the phone at the same time, 4 times more likely to crash. Texting and driving, 164 times more likely to crash. Students in a meta-analysis who studied in silence performed 60% better, 60% better than students who studied with music on. And there are study after study after study showing that when we're trying to do what's called complex multitasking, we start to impair our performance and create a sense of stress and overwhelm. And so a question for you at this point in the workshop is this: what are you doing right now? What are you paying attention to? Is your full attention on what I'm saying, or are you doing or thinking about something else? And that's a very important question to start asking ourselves during the day, because, you know, if we can't multitask, then anything else that we're doing, whether it's a behavior, an activity, or just thinking about something else, is taking us away from what we're doing. So right now, right, what are you paying attention to? And one of the reasons that I've just asked that question is because I know, again, from research, that half the time I'm talking today, so for 15 out of the 30 minutes, you're not going to hear what I'm talking about, because 46.9% of the time, according to research, we're daydreaming. This was some research out of Harvard in 2015. So a couple of researchers, ironically perhaps, they installed an app on people's smartphones, and at random times throughout the day, an alert would go off asking the people in the study whether they were paying attention to what was happening or whether they were daydreaming or thinking about something else. And the researchers found that 46.9% of the time, they reported that they were thinking about something else. So half the time we're alive, half the time we're awake, half the time I'm talking to you today, we're daydreaming. So right there, I mean, that has massive implications for productivity and job performance, because if we could reduce that number, I mean, if we could drop that number to 0, then we would potentially double our performance, double our productivity. Don't think we can do that, but if we reduce it at all, it's going to boost our productivity, isn't it? It's also going to make us happier, because these researchers that I mentioned, David Killingsworth and Matthew Gilbert, when that alert went off for their participants, they were asked, what are you paying attention to right now? How happy are you on a scale of 1 to 100? And at the moment that that alert went off, what were you doing? Like, what activity were you engaged in? And when they crunched the stats, they found what people were doing wasn't important. What was predicting happiness is whether people were paying attention or not. And the people who were paying attention when that alert went off tended to be much happier overall, right? So that's a really important finding. And of course, if we can train our attention, we could potentially be more productive and happier. And the great news is that we can. Our mind is like a muscle, and if we exercise it, it gets stronger. And our ability to pay attention is something that we can also train. And of course, right now, if your mind wanders off and you just bring it back to what I'm saying, that's training yourself to pay attention. And if you want to take that to the next level, you can train it with what's called meditation. So there are different types of meditation, right? They're all attention training exercises. So we can focus our attention on a mantra, on a visualization, heaps of different things, right? Limitless things. Mindfulness meditation, which is what the bulk of the research is around, means that we focus our attention on what's happening right now in this moment. And what's happening right now is happening through your body. So if you were to take a moment to just feel your body sitting on the chair, that would bring your attention into the present. Then it would inevitably wander off, right? At least half the time it's going to be somewhere else. But if we notice, we can bring it back. It wanders off, we bring it back, we bring it back, we bring it back. And if we do that over time, we're going to get faster at noticing when the mind wanders off and better at bringing ourselves back and coming back without any further thinking or getting frustrated or judging ourselves. And so I'm going to invite you now just to take a couple of moments to do this. Just take a few minutes just to do some meditation. So if you're up for doing it, I'm going to ask you just to sit with a straight back so that we can fall awake and be more alert, and close the eyes so you can pay more attention to your body. And just start by feeling your feet on the floor and the contact that your body makes with whatever you're sitting on. Just feeling the pressure, feeling the weight of the body, the connection with the ground. Scanning your attention through your body and just noticing any areas of muscle tension, perhaps starting to release that a little bit. Just letting that go. Almost immediately you notice the mind wander off, starts to think about meditation or think about something else. Just bring it back. Come back to feeling your body, feet on the floor, body in the chair. Bring your attention to your breathing. Just take a few deep, slow breaths. If we slow down the breathing and particularly make the out breath longer than the in breath, that activates our parasympathetic nervous system and calms us down. But actually, in the end, mindfulness meditation is not a breathing exercise. So you could even just stop trying to control your breath and just let your body breathe as naturally as you can without trying to manipulate it, and just use it as an anchor. Notice what it feels like to breathe in and breathe out. So just feeling the in-breath, feeling the out-breath, noticing the mind wander off over and over and over again, and just bringing it back each time without any further thinking, without any judgment. We're not trying to stop the mind from wandering. That's very important. We can't stop it. And if we do that, then we'll just end up focusing more on the distractions. So we just come back. The mind will keep wandering, but if we get better at noticing, we can just come back. And now we're just back in the present. Wanders off again, and we bring it back. And this is all meditation is. Good. So just allowing the eyes to open. So there's a few minutes of mindfulness meditation, just in case that's the first time any of you have done that before. Now, during that meditation, something that happened that's really quite important is the fact that every time our attention wandered off, and without any further thinking or judgment, we just brought it back to the breath, back to the body, we activated our prefrontal cortex, right, to do that. Now, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for what are called executive functions. Things like attentional control, that's prefrontal cortex doing that, right? And what that means is every time you brought your attention back, you activated this part of your brain that you see here. And we now know that if we activate a brain area, we strengthen it. So we form new connections, or what are called synapses between the neurons. So every time you brought your attention back just then, you formed a few new connections. And of course, as we do that, the neuroscience studies show over a period of minutes and days and weeks, we form more and more of those connections. And the neurons actually have to move further apart to accommodate those connections. So we literally grow this part of our brain. So every time your attention wandered and you brought it back, that's like doing a mental rep. And if you brought your attention back a bunch of times in that few minutes there, you just did a bunch of mental reps, meaning your prefrontal cortex is now a bit stronger and your ability to pay attention has also been strengthened. The prefrontal cortex also helps us to think clearly and plan. It's where our short-term memory is located, helps us to manage our emotions, to control impulses, and it's associated with self-awareness as well. So all of these things are now a little bit stronger in you. And if you were to do just a little bit of meditation every day, even just 5 or 10 minutes, according to the research, you would very quickly start to notice that all of these things got stronger, which of course is a very useful thing to cultivate. It's a great investment. So just finishing off talking about training attention, right? If we're at home, once we've set up a good environment and we're managing our technology well, we want to make sure that we're managing our attention well. So unitasking, right? Focusing on one thing at a time, and training our attention, just doing a few minutes of meditation in the morning. Karen May, who's the head of people and culture at Google, she does every time she goes into a meeting, she takes one breath. She calls it her 6-second mindfulness practice. Just stops, takes a breath, and arrives fully in that moment. So when she goes into the meeting, she's ready for whatever's there and not mentally dragging her day around with her. And that can be a very good thing to do in between tasks. Just taking a breath or spending a minute or a couple of minutes just meditating. I mean, even right now, just pause, take a breath, let go of any tension that you might be holding, and then we just get back to the conversation. So to wrap up, here are 3 tips that are hopefully going to really help you. So managing your environment, managing technology, and managing your attention. And a lot of companies now, including major technology companies, Google, Apple, IBM, they're all embracing mindfulness to boost resilience, to boost productivity and creativity, but also to boost leadership. The foundation of being able to do good coaching or good leadership or good management is mindfulness. If you look at the 5 core components of emotional intelligence, it's things like self-regulation. If we can't manage our attention, we can't manage anything else about what we're doing, let alone manage others effectively. Self-awareness, knowing what we're feeling and thinking and what's happening from moment to moment. Motivation, being in touch with our values, being able to communicate them clearly. And then you've got social skills and empathy. They're the 5 components of emotional intelligence. And so mindfulness is either synonymous with or fundamental to all of those things. So hopefully you're taking away some tips. I've given you a bunch of different sort of strategies and 3 key areas that you might work on to make sure that you're one of those people who works from home effectively and has a good time doing that. Just apply one or more of them consistently. That's the important thing, to practice this stuff. So to do it consistently, whether it's meditation, unitasking, managing technology, managing your environment. But hopefully you're taking away something practical and simple. That's what I love about mindfulness. It gives us practical, simple things that we can do.